All right, let's dive into a real economic puzzle, one that takes a popular, common-sense idea and flips it completely on its head. It all starts with a question about something we see all over the world.
I mean, really think about that for a second. The countries that are most plugged into the global economy, the ones with tons of trade, they often have the biggest welfare states. It feels backwards, right? More global capitalism should mean less government, not more. So what gives? That's the mystery we're going to solve today.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, we've got to start with the classic explanation. It's a really popular theory that's been the go-to answer for decades. It's called the compensation hypothesis. And the idea is pretty simple, actually. It says the welfare state is basically a kind of national insurance policy. It's like a lifeboat on the stormy seas of the global economy. As a country opens itself up to trade, it gets exposed to all these global shocks. So the government has to step in and protect people. Makes sense, right? It's clean, it's elegant.
And this is the logic, laid out step by step. The theory argues there's this really clear chain of events. Openness leads to risk. Risk makes voters nervous and they demand more security. And then politicians, wanting to get reelected, respond by building a bigger government. Boom. Each step seems to flow perfectly from the last. For a long, long time, this was the accepted story.
But what happens when you actually start to poke at this story? Pull on the threads a little bit. Well, it turns out the whole thing starts to unravel. Let's see where the cracks start to show.
So, the first big issue, the very foundation of the whole idea, that connection, that positive link between an open economy and a big government, turns out to be, well, surprisingly weak when you put it under a microscope.
And this isn't just one study finding a problem, it's a whole pattern. For instance, researchers found that as soon as you factor in how big a country is, the connection gets a lot weaker. Then there's the fact that it only seems to work as a single snapshot in time. If you look at how things change over the years, the link disappears. And it gets worse. Depending on what data you use or which countries you look at, you get totally different answers. In huge parts of the world, like non-OECD Asia, the connection just isn't there at all. The main takeaway is that the core evidence for this whole theory is shaky at best.
Okay, so the big picture correlation is wobbly. But what about the individual steps in that chain we saw earlier? Let's go back and check each link, one by one, to see if it holds up.
First up, the big assumption at the very beginning. Does opening your economy to the world really make you more unstable and more risky?
Well, it turns out the reality might be the complete opposite. It's like your personal investment portfolio, right? You don't put all your money in one stock. That's risky. You diversify. It's the same for countries. Economic theory tells us that by trading with lots of different partners, a country can actually spread out its risk and become more stable, not less. And the data tends to agree. Studies from folks like Don and Kim found that more open economies often aren't more volatile at all.
Okay, so the first link is broken, but what about the next one? Maybe, even if there isn't more risk, people in open economies feel like there is, and so they demand more protection from the government.
And here we go again. The data points in the exact opposite direction of the theory. This is a huge one. Research by Ursula Dallinger in 2013 found that the more open a country's economy gets, the less social security its citizens tend to demand. So, another critical link in the chain just snapped.
All right, 2 links down, 1 to go. But let's just pretend for a second that governments in open economies do spend more money. Are they actually spending it on the stuff the compensation hypothesis says they should be? Things like unemployment benefits, the actual insurance programs.
And the answer, once again, is a big fat no. A 2007 study by Shelton found that the extra government spending we see isn't actually going into those risk insurance buckets. So the way the money is being spent doesn't even match the supposed reason for spending it. So the takeaway here is just, wow, not a single link in that clean, simple causal chain actually holds up when you test it.
So, this is where things get really, really cool. We've completely taken apart the old idea, now it's time to build a new one. What if we've been looking at this whole thing completely backwards?
This slide right here, this is the whole flip. The old story was that openness creates a problem, risk, that a big government has to come in and solve. But the new idea, the new reality, suggests the total opposite. A big government creates its own set of problems, and economic openness is actually the solution to those problems. The cause and effect are completely reversed.
So, how on earth does that work? Why would a country with a huge welfare state actually need to be wide open to the global economy just to survive? Let's break it down. There are three big reasons why this works. First, specialization. Countries with high taxes tend to be really good at making very specialized things, like high-tech machinery or pharmaceuticals. But to make that work, you can't just sell to your own people. You need a huge global market. Second, they can actually export their high costs. They create these unique, high-quality products that people all over the world are willing to pay a premium for. So they're basically passing their high domestic wages and taxes on to global consumers. And third, their own citizens get a huge benefit from importing cheap stuff. Local services might be pricey, but trade makes everything else, from electronics to clothes, way more affordable, which makes everyone's life better.
You know, the political economist Torben Iversen really nailed this idea back in 2005. He argued that for these big welfare states, the real threat isn't trade and competition. The real threat is a lack of it. Putting up walls would be a disaster, trapping them and making it impossible to afford their own system.
So what's the big picture here? We've gone from this simple story about government protecting citizens from the world to a much more complex and frankly more interesting story about how governments and the global economy depend on each other.
If you take away one thing, it should be this. Trade isn't the storm that the welfare state lifeboat is built to survive. Instead, trade is the powerful engine that keeps the lifeboat running, allowing it to stay afloat in the first place. Economic openness isn't a problem to be solved. It's a necessary tool that makes a big, high-tax welfare state possible in the long run.
And that leads us to one final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. If these high-tax countries need global markets to sell their expensive stuff and need other countries to produce cheap goods for their citizens, does that mean they're sort of free-riding on the more rough-and-tumble capitalist systems elsewhere? It's a really challenging question raised by economists like Darren Acemoglu, and it leaves us with a totally new way of thinking about globalization and the governments we build.